welcome to the Center for Spiritual Deepening. Welcome to our friends on Zoom, those of you who are with us in person and those of you who are with us online. We're delighted to have you with us. Before we start talking about this evening's program, I'd like to give you a sense of some things coming up at the Center for Spiritual Deepening in the next couple of months. So this series will be this weekend next. Then in November, 3 Tuesdays in November, we have Laura Schulman, who is an assistant professor of religion at Northern Virginia Community College. And she's going to spend 3 weeks with us talking about Eastern religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, beliefs and practices, and helping us make connections between those faiths and our own. So that's in November. Also in November, kind of right in the middle of that, 17th of November on a Friday evening, some of you will remember we launched the program year with an event on Sabbath, where our own rector, Laura Cochran, and Martin Doppelmayr, who is a documentary filmmaker, did a conversation with us here, introducing the theme, the idea, the practice of Sabbath, and what Sabbath has to do with our lives, how it's relevant in today's world. And that came from Martin Doppelmayr has recently produced a film, a documentary film, his most recent, called Sabbath, that's been airing on public television stations. And we have the pleasure of being able to actually show that film here at St. Aidan's. So on the 17th of November, on a Friday evening, we'll feed you, since you'll be coming from somewhere, feed folks, and then do a viewing of that film. And then a couple of weeks later, on December the 1st, we'll gather again for dinner again, because why not, and have a discussion. What have we noticed in the film? What do we want to carry forth about this theme of Sabbath into our lives? Because this Sabbath theme will kind of run throughout the program year. So those are the things coming up in the near future. The other thing that I want to highlight for those who may know and not remember, or may not know at all, there are some Thursday events that have been happening at the Center for Spiritual Deepening regularly for years. They've started up again for the fall. And if you are curious about them, would like to know more about them, we want you to know what's out there. So on first and third Thursdays, there's a group that has been meeting for years to discuss the Gospel of Thomas. And they have been through every Logian in the Gospel of Thomas. It took some years to do that. And so this year they're starting to work with the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. So if you're interested in that, and sitting with that group and exploring that text and having those conversations, you can send us an email at info@centerforspiritualdeepening.org. We'd be happy to connect you to that group. Alternate Thursdays, the Soul Circle is a group that meets with without a consistent text, but rather with the people who choose to gather, each in turn choosing a text that has spoken to them. It could be poetry, it can be the Tao Te Ching, it can be any number of things. And we bring things from our own spiritual practice and share them, and just share discussion of our spiritual lives in that circle. So that's on second and fourth Thursdays. Similarly, if you are interested, send us an email. We'd be happy to tell you more about that group as well. So those are the things that are coming up. But now to turn, I can't move, right? Because of the camera, I have to stand still. The thing I really want to talk about is what we get to do tonight, which is that our own Russ Bradley, who has been at St. Aidan's for a long time, who has been with the center since the beginning, and has, I think, done everything that a person can do at the center, sat in every circle, been in every group. I don't think there's anything at the center that Russ has not been a part of. And I don't know, at some point the conversation comes up that Russ has some things that he knows and loves and could share with us. And so it's pretty cool that tonight he can be sitting on the presenter's side of the table. I was thinking about, what would I want to say about Russ and what he can talk about. For me, the answer is everything. I find Russ to be a student of everything, and possibly having immediate recall of more things than I will ever even learn or hear in my whole life. I told him, if I took away your slides tonight and said, actually, could you just do like the early history of Christianity for 90 minutes? And he would go, yeah, and do that. Also could do the same thing on the history of the Grateful Dead, but we won't ask you to do that here tonight. So one of the things that I'll let Russ tell you about, because only he can tell it right, is that one of the things he's been doing for many years is meditating and sitting Zazen, which he now does with a group in Delray, and exploring people like Dogen who have something to tell us about what that sitting has to do with our lives. I'll just leave it at that and let Russ do the rest. So I bring you Russ Bradley, and we're going to give him a little second here, a little technical moment to switch over so that he can share slides with you all in the room and with folks on Zoom, and then I'll let him take this spot. Russ.
Good evening, everybody. Pleasure to see you here. We have more people on Zoom tonight than we have in the room, but that's okay. Tonight's talk is on Dogen Zenji and original enlightenment and his great question. I name him as Japan's first Zen master. He wasn't the first guy to bring Zen back to Japan. Eihei did that, but Eihei never left the Tendai sect, whereas Dogen founded the Soto order. So last February, L.J. Malone did a series on John Scotus Eriugena. And in that, he presented the teachings of Pseudo Dionysius, who was an influence on Eriugena, along with Eriugena. And this, what he presented really resonated with me, with my nose being into Dogen at the time. There's this particular mindset that to achieve mystical union, you have to leave thinking behind. And Pseudo Dionysius is somewhat esoteric, known mostly in academic circles. Eriugena has been discovered in recent years. I heard about him in a book by John Philip Newell. And Dogen, as we shall see, left a much bigger legacy in this regard. So Dogen's story is that he had a great question or a great doubt, and he spent 14 years of his life pursuing the great question, and he spent the remaining 26 years of his life actualizing the answer. What was his question? As I study both the exoteric and esoteric schools of Buddhism, they maintain that human beings are endowed with Dharma nature by birth. If this is the case, why did the Buddhas of all ages, undoubtedly in possession of enlightenment, find it necessary to seek enlightenment and engage in spiritual practice? So Dogen's answer is, this Dharma is abundantly present in each human being, but if we do not practice it, it does not manifest itself. And if we do not experience it, it cannot be realized. So in short, Dogen sees practice itself as a manifestation of enlightenment. Who was Dogen? Eihei Dogen, also known as Dogen Zenji or Dogen Kaigen, was a Japanese Buddhist priest originally in the Tendai school. He was a writer, poet, and philosopher who traveled to China to study and returned to found the Soto lineage of Japanese Zen Buddhism. He's sort of Saint Benedict, Saint Thomas Aquinas, and Meister Eckhart all rolled into one. Like Saint Benedict, he founded and wrote the rules for a monastic order. Like Thomas Aquinas, he was a mystic who wrote extensively and wasn't afraid to use reasoned arguments. And like Meister Eckhart, he urged his students to turn inward to seek the divine. So why do we want to talk about Dogen? He presents a unique blend of mysticism and pragmatism that has been labeled as a mystical realist. He's a dominant force in natural philosophy and the ecology movement. He anticipates a lot of movements in 20th century philosophy by 800 years. For instance, Martin Heidegger wrote Being in Time in 1927. Dogen had written Being in Time as a essay back 800 years prior in the 1230s. Also, Dogen touches on issues related to quantum physics that we don't really get to in the 20th century. Dogen's understanding of time and Dogen's understanding of the interconnectedness of everything falls right in with quantum physics understanding of time and quantum interconnections. So, in doing research for this, I stumbled on this website called worldcat.org that is like a roll-up of library catalogs globally. And so what you have here is, this is a graph of Dogen publications. The orange are books by Dogen, and the blue are books about Dogen. And right here is 1940. And as you can see, interest in Dogen started spiking about then. One thing or one cause of that was Japanese was rapidly westernizing and industrializing after Commodore Perry opened them up. And in 1926, a cultural historian by the name of Watsuji Tetsuro wrote an essay called Shamon Dogen, or Dogen a Monk, and stated in that essay, henceforth, Dogen is no longer Dogen, the founder of the sect, but our Dogen. And he more or less proclaimed Dogen as Japan's national philosopher. And so at first, pretty much in the run-up to World War II, there was a lot of friction between academia and Sotoshu over who owned Dogen. But after World War II, academia and Sotoshu have worked more closely together to promote Dogen. But as you can see, from World War II on, both the publication of Dogen's books and books about Dogen have spiked. One of the things I found interesting was the libraries that carried books by Dogen, which you could find on this website. I wasn't surprised that they had stuff in the Virginia Theological Seminary Library or even the National Library of Education, but I was really surprised to see that they had Dogen works in the Institute for Defense Analysis Library and the U.S. Naval Academy's Nimitz Library. So interest in Dogen is growing in interesting quarters. Dogen's writings. Since the mid-90s, everything Dogen's written has been translated into English. Dogen's major works are, first of all, the Shobo Genzo. But realize there's three Shobo Genzos. There's a Shobo Genzo, Shinji Shobo Genzo, which is a collection of 305 koans that are written in Chinese characters, hence the name Shinji Shobo Genzo. And then there's Shobo Genzo Zui Monkey, which it translates as Shobo Genzo Things Said. Those are informal talks that were compiled by his student and Dharma heir, Eijo. But the Shobo Genzo that we're going to be talking about and looking at is the Kana Shobo Genzo. It was one of the first works written in the Japanese vernacular with the Japanese alphabet. And it's considered his masterwork. Depending upon the edition you get, it will have either 95 or 96 essays or fascicles. And they just cover an immense amount of subjects. He wanted to do 100, but he died before he could finish it. So then the next writing is the Eihei Koroko, or Dogen's extensive record. These are later writings that started in about 1239 and went on until his death. They're based on formal Dharma talks with 3 chapters, with 1 chapter of informal meetings and instruction, 1 chapter of koans, and 1 chapter of poems. along with 7 other chapters of Dharma talks. And then the third work that's considered important is the Eihei Shingi, and this, or Dogen's Pure Standards for the Zen Community. And this contains particularly a work known as Instructions for the Cook, or Tenzo Kyokun. Tonight, we're going to look at a writing called Fukanzazengi. It's the first thing he wrote when he got back from China. And while it isn't bundled in the, while it wasn't originally a part of the collections, it's included as an appendix in most editions of the Shobo Genzo these days. In terms of accessing Dogen, Shunryo Suzuki's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind was my first exposure to him, and really where I got softened up to his teachings. And I would recommend that to anybody. I think it's probably the best book in the English language on meditation. Kaz Tanahashi has said that Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind is the Shobo Genzo in condensed form. And from what I can tell, he pretty much covers most of the topics that Dogen did in the Shobo Genzo. There's also a millennial Zen teacher by the name of Brad Warner, who's also a punk rock bassist. He has a book called Don't Be a Jerk, which is a paraphrase of Dogen's Shobo Genzo. I found that very useful. I'll read one of his chapters in the paraphrase and then go read it in Dogen, and it makes it more digestible. He also has a video channel on YouTube called Hardcore Zen, where he pretty much daily posts something that runs anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. And he often expounds on Dogen's teachings in these videos. And so I would recommend that as well. As far as Zen commentaries, any of these 4, if you look them up, have a number of books out there. John Daido Lori is a photographer from LA who was a student of Maezumi Roshi. He founded the Zen Mountain Monastery in upstate New York and the Mountains and Rivers Sangha. Tegan Dan Layton is a resident at Green Gulch in Muir Beach, Green Gulch Farm, which is an extension of the San Francisco Zen Center. And he also teaches at the Unified Seminary at UCal Berkeley. Shohaku Okamura has headed up the Minnesota Zen Center, is now at the Bloomington, Indiana Zen Center, and does a lot of Dogen translation and commentary. And Kaz Tanahashi is a calligrapher and Zen teacher and artist. He produced one of the major translations of the Shobo Genzo and has several books of commentary on Dogen's teachings. Also, there's the field of Dogen studies. Just like Jung or Teilhard or Wittgenstein, Dogen can be a very dense read. And so it's helpful to have people who critically study his texts and write more digestible summaries and commentaries on the material. In this case, Hee-Jim Kim is a professor emeritus from the University of Oregon. He wrote the first book in English that was a comprehensive history of Dogen and explanation of his teachings, Eihei Dogen, Mystical Realist. It's an excellent book. And then Stephen Heine is probably the current leader in the field of Dogen studies. I used his Dogen, Japan's Original Zen Teacher, extensively for this series. And he also has another book he edited called Dogen Textual and Historical Studies. So moving into Dogen's story, first we need to take care of a few preliminaries. This is the Chinese character for Chan. In China, this character is pronounced Chan. In Japan, this character is pronounced Zen. And this presents sort of an issue with language that we see. When you're talking about the Chinese masters, you've got their name in Chinese and their name in Japanese. And in Chinese, you've got your choice. You know, it could either be in Wade Giles or it could be in Pinyin, which is the current way of translating Chinese. So it all gets very confusing. So hopefully I won't make your head hurt with this. In most cases, I'm going to include both the Chinese and the Japanese names where appropriate. So key terms. One term you're going to hear thrown around a lot is Dharma. Dharma is a Sanskrit word that means teaching or law. And in Buddhism, it's kind of used as a container for the teachings of the Buddha. Buddhists tend to throw around the word Dharma the way Christians throw around the word gospel. You know, they're going to spread the Dharma, preach the Dharma, those sorts of things. Now, little d Dharma means something different. Little d Dharma means phenomenon. So in Buddhist writings, if you see little d Dharma or the myriad Dharmas is simply the Buddhist way of saying all phenomena. So that's that. Lineage is important, particularly in Zen. Zen teachers can trace their lineage all the way back to Gautama Buddha. They have charts of their lineages. This is because they believe that they are transmitting the teachings of the Buddha that can't be conveyed in writing. This is actually what the term Shobogenzo means. The true Dharma eye is the eye that can discern the teachings of the Buddha outside of the sutras in everyday life. And so Buddhist teachers or Zen teachers rely on a direct mind transmission to pass the teaching along, a direct experience of the teaching. Samadhi is another word that we'll introduce here. Samadhi is a state of unfocused concentration. You could also say that the activity of consciousness is stopped and we cease to be aware of time, space, and causation. It's the experience of pure being. You don't need to be realized in order to experience samadhi, but you have to attain samadhi in order to be realized. And then finally, Tathagata and Sakyamuni are terms used for the Buddha. The Buddha refers to himself as Tathagata in the sutras. That translates as thus come one, thus gone one, both of them. And there's been a number of essays written on this, that the fact that the Tathagata refers to being thus come and thus gone. And then Sakyamuni translates as sage of the Sakya clan. The Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was a member of the Sakya clan, and Muni is the Sanskrit word for sage. So Sakyamuni and Tathagata are terms used to refer to the historical Buddha. I want to venture a little bit into the weeds of Buddhist sects. I don't want to get into it too deep, but the problem is that it's pertinent to this story. Dogen came out of the Tendai school. The Tendai school in Japan is the Tiantai school in China. These are schools that basically they filter all the teachings through the Lotus Sutra. They use the Lotus Sutra as a filter, and they have esoteric rituals that they use to work their way into enlightenment. They have a teaching of original enlightenment, but in the Tendai school, you have to go through these esoteric rituals to get there. It was the first form of Mahayana Buddhism that took on Chinese cultural character after it was imported from India. Then you had the Renzai school, or known as the Linji school in China. And both, in the case of the Zen schools, they're named after teachers. Renzai Dogen is the Japanese name for, hold on, with Lianji Yishuan. So yeah, Lianji Yishuan and Renzai Dogen are the same person. They're the founder of the school. In China, it was known as Lianji. In Japan, as Renzai. This was brought to Japan by Myoan Eihei, who received Dharma transmission in China back in 1187 and brought it to Japan. Then the Soto school, which was found by Dogen, is called the Shaodong school in China, named after Shaoshan Benji and Dongshan Lianji. Basically, Sozan Honjaku is the Japanese name for Shaoshan Benji, and Tozan Ryokai is the Japanese name for Dongshan Lianji. Renzai was basically a more urban school that catered to the elites in the samurai class. Soto Zen was more out in the countryside. And in fact, there are more Soto Zen temples in Japan today than any other denomination. But ultimately, Eihei left the city and planted his Zen in the countryside. Are there any questions regarding these schools? They're going to be rubbing and brushing up against each other through the course of this story. Okie doke. Moving on, for the historical context, this all occurred in the Kamakura period, which was the period of shoguns and samurai. It was a period when Japan turned away from the aristocracy and turned towards the landed gentry who had enough wealth to be able to build armies. This was the period of time when the Japanese samurai class emerged and Japanese feudalism took hold. 6 schools of Buddhism were founded in this period. 3 schools of Pure Land Buddhism, Jodo-Shu, and Jishu. And then there was Nichiren. Nichiren broke off and founded his school of Buddhism. Then Eihei founded Renzai Zen, and Dogen founded Soto Zen. 6 schools of Buddhism broke out of Tendai during this period. So, any questions on the Kamakura period or any of that? This is Kamakura period is the period when Japan started breaking off from China, and instead of borrowing Chinese cultural forms, they began to develop their own cultural forms. And this is exemplified by 6 new schools of Buddhism in this period. So let's move on to Dogen's story. Dogen himself was born into Japanese nobility and was actually the spawn of 2 of the most powerful clans in Japan, the Minamotos and the Fujiwaras. And in fact, it was the fighting between the Minamotos and the Fujiwaras that produced the Kamakura period. Dogen is an 8th generation descendant from Emperor Murakami. He was considered a prodigy. He could read and write both Chinese and Japanese at the age of 4, and they began grooming him for the imperial court. His father died at the age when he was 2 years old, and then his mother died when he was 7 years old, and he was taken into custody by his uncle. mother on her deathbed made him promise to become a monk. And at his mother's funeral, he was struck by the smoke of the incense rising. Apparently, that really drove home the impermanence of everything. And that made dealing with impermanence a major issue for him his whole life. So, Dogen was under the care of his uncle Fujiwara Moroi, and who was childless and had no son. So he was grooming Dogen for the imperial court, and he was also grooming Dogen to make him an heir. So for Dogen's 12th birthday, he scheduled a Japanese coming out party, or a Genpuku. Dogen got upset by this and realized that he was being put in a spot. So he ran away from home, so to speak, and went to another uncle on his mother's side, who was a monk up on Mount Eihei at Enriakaju Monastery. His uncle Ryokan told him his other uncle had great expectations for him and that he needed to go back. But Dogen told his uncle, when my loving mother passed away, he made a request by saying, you should go forth from household life and become a student of the way. Therefore, I do not want to be involved with the futility of the profane world. I want to make a home departure so as to repay the blessings of my grandmother, aunts, and mothers. Well, he won Ryokan over, and so Ryokan took him in as a novice. And a year later, at Enriakaju Monastery, Dogen is initiated into the Tendai sect, and he takes the 48 Bodhisattva vows of the Tendai sect. He doesn't take the 240 Theravada vows, and this is going to bite him when he gets to China, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So at 1214, Dogen is more or less fed up by the Tendai school and decides to leave Mount Eihei. Basically, so let me show you. So this is Enriakaju Monastery, one of the most significant monasteries in the history of Japan. This is where Dogen took his vows and took the tonsure. It was a pretty powerful monastery. They actually had warrior monks there, and they contracted mercenaries and samurais in order to enforce their policies and their will around. So Dogen had confronted the Tendai teachings, and it just wasn't answering his questions. So Dogen decided to look for a teacher. After leaving Mount Eihei, he visited Onjoji Temple, where another maternal uncle was, and basically presented him with his question. And so what I'm going to do now is turn to Fukanzazengi. This was the first thing Dogen wrote when he got back from China. And this pretty much frames Dogen's question. He frames the questions and answers in this document. So I'm going to read the first 3 paragraphs right here, which is Dogen's main question. The way is originally perfect and all-pervading. How could it be contingent upon practice and realization? The Dharma vehicle is utterly free and untrammeled. What need is there for our concentrated effort? Indeed, the whole body is far beyond the world's dust. Who could believe in a means to brush it clean? It is never apart from you right where you are. What use is there going off here and there to practice? And yet, if there is the slightest discrepancy, the way is as distant as heaven from earth. If the least like or dislike arises, the mind is lost in confusion. Suppose you gain pride of understanding, inflate your own achievement, glimpse the wisdom that runs through all things, attain the way, and clarify your mind, raising an aspiration to escalate the very sky. You are making an initial partial excursion through the frontiers of the Dharma, but you are still deficient in the vital way of total emancipation. Need I mention the Buddha, who was possessed of inborn knowledge? The influence of his 6 years of upright sitting is noticeable still, or Bodhidharma's transmission of the mind seal. The fame of his 9 years of wall sitting is celebrated to this day. Since this was the case with the saints of old, how can we today dispense with negotiation of the way? So these are Dogen's initial arguments in Fukanzazengi that more or less sum up his basic question. He continues to look for a teacher. His uncle told him he recommended Kanenji Monastery and Zen and Eihei. So Dogen went in 1214, visited Kanenji briefly, and had a brief encounter with Eihei, and then proceeds to move on and check out a number of other monasteries over the next couple of years. Finally, in 1217, he settles at Kanenji Monastery and takes on Myozan, Eihei's Dharma heir, as a teacher. Eihei had died in 1215. And Dogen arrived at Kanenji 2 years after Eihei died. And so Dogen quietly studies under Myozan for 6 years. This is Kanenji Temple. It claims to be the first Zen temple in Japan. However, it's not a pure Zen temple. They had Tendai study programs, and they also conducted Tendai esoteric rituals. So it wasn't really a pure Zen temple. And it must not have been getting the job done too well, because Myozan and Dogen decided they needed to go to China. And so in the spring of 1223, Dogen, Myozan, and several others from Kanenji Temple depart for China. Myozan is able to go immediately to the temple on Mount Tiantong, where Eihei had received transmission, but Dogen is held up at the docks. It appears that there was a law in Sung, China, that said if you were coming over for religious purposes, you had to take all 280 some of the precepts, the 240 some Theravada precepts, and the 48 Tiantai precepts as well. So Dogen, it wasn't clear in my reading, they never made it clear whether he actually took the precepts or whether he just went through a lot of long paperwork. But it was 3 months before Dogen was able to make it up to the monastery where Myozan was. But interestingly, while he was on board there, the Tenzo, the chief cook from another monastery near Mount Tiantong, came to get some shiitake mushrooms. And he and Dogen got in a conversation, and Dogen asked him, said, why don't you just go ahead and stay the night here on the ship and leave in the morning? And the Tenzo told him that he couldn't do that. He needed to be back there to serve breakfast in the morning. And so he felt it would belittle his duty to serve the community. And Dogen was quite impressed with this. And he must have been impressed with Dogen as well, because 6 months later he retired. And after he retired, he came and visited Dogen at Mount Tiantong. And Dogen later refers to his interactions with him in an essay in the Eihei Shingi that says, talks about the cook, lessons for the cook, and he tells this story about this cook. So Dogen isn't terribly happy at Mount Tiantong. It seems that foreigners are lower in the pecking order, lower in the hierarchy than even the novices. And Dogen isn't happy with that. And also, he is not impressed with the teacher Wuji. So in the spring of 1224, Wuji dies, and Dogen decides it's time to leave, and he goes wandering around visiting the other monasteries in the 5 mountains of Chan. He visits the other 4 mountains and checks out the other 4 monasteries. So after spending about a year reviewing these practices and everything, and he's getting fairly disappointed, Dogen's starting to think about returning to Japan, and a couple of things occur. He hears a couple of things, actually. He hears that Myozen has fallen ill, and he hears that there is now a new abbot at Mount Tiantong. So Dogen goes back to Mount Tiantong, and shortly after he returns, Myozen dies. But at Mount Tiantong, Dogen meets Rujing, who ends up being his great teacher. It appears that on the way to Mount Tiantong, Dogen was having dreams about meeting his great teacher, and while he was traveling there, Rujing was having dreams about meeting his student. But Tiantong Rujing was the one who was appointed as abbot of the monastery. He was of Saodong school, not the Renzai school. Chinese government appointed the abbots to the monasteries, and it didn't matter to them which school a particular abbot belonged to. So Dogen meets Rujing, who practices just sitting, or Zhiguan Dazhuo. Dogen translates this as Shikantaza, and this is one of the main criteria of Soto Zen, is they practice Shikantaza as opposed to Renzai koan introspection. In Soto Zen, you just sit. When Dogen raises his great question, what they said is that Rujing broke the spear point of his false self-assurance in him. And for whatever reason, Dogen liked that and responded, and they developed a father-son relationship. Rujing asked Dogen to be his attendant. Dogen declined, but asked Rujing if he could come to his abbot's quarters any hour of the day with his questions, and Rujing agreed. And so developed this relationship. Well, it wasn't long, and Dogen's question is answered. Dogen has an experience of realization. During summer ongo, Dogen spontaneously experiences the shedding of hindrances, the surpassing of all attachments and impediments to attain insight into the Dharma, casting off body and mind. There's actually an account of Dogen's enlightenment in Keizan's transmission of the light. Keizan is a Soto abbot about 4 generations or 50 years after Dogen. So this account was written 50 years after Dogen's enlightenment. Dogen studied with Zen master Rujing. Once during meditation, sitting late at night, Rujing said to the assembly, "Zen study is the shedding of mind and body." Hearing this, suddenly Dogen was greatly enlightened. He went right to the abbot's room and lit incense. Rujing asked him, "What are you burning incense for?" Dogen said, "My body and mind have been shed." Rujing said, "Body and mind shed. shed body and mind. Dogen said, this is a temporary byway. Don't approve me arbitrarily. Rujing said, I'm not. Dogen said, what is that which isn't an arbitrary approval? Rujing said, shedding body and mind. Dogen bowed. Rujing said, the shedding is shed. So shedding body and mind is the hallmark of Dogen's enlightenment. That's the phrase he uses and continues to use. And in fact, this is what he says in Fukanzazengi. In the fourth paragraph, he says, you should therefore cease from practice on intellectual understanding, pursuing words and following after speech, and learn the backward step that turns your light inwardly to illuminate yourself. Body and mind of themselves will drop away, and your original face will be manifest. If you want to attain suchness, you should practice suchness without delay. He continued to study for a year and a half with Rujing, and then in 1227, Rujing told him he was great as the sages of old and gave him Dharma transmission. So Dogen returned to Kaninji Temple with Myozen's ashes, and he wrote Fukanzazengi. This is Fukanzazengi in Dogen's own calligraphy. It's currently at Eihei Monastery and has been proclaimed a Japanese national treasure. And so following on in Fukanzazengi, are there any questions or comments up to this point? Because what we're going to do now is look at most of the rest of Fukanzazengi. So then Dogen gives, in Fukanzazengi, gives specific instructions on the physical aspects of Zazen. He says, for the practice of Zen, a quiet room is suitable. Eat and drink moderately. Cast aside all involvements and cease all affairs. Do not think good. Do not think bad. Do not administer pros and cons. Cease all the movements of the conscious mind, engaging of all thoughts and views. Have no designs on becoming a Buddha. Sit upright in correct bodily posture, inclining neither to the left nor the right, leaning neither forward nor backward. Be sure your ears are on a plane with your shoulders and your nose in line with your navel. Place your tongue against the front roof of your mouth with teeth and lips both shut. Your eyes should always remain open. You should breathe gently through your nose. And then he ventures into the land of non-thinking, saying, once you have adjusted yourself into this posture, take a deep breath, inhale, exhale, rock your body to the right and left, and settle into a steady, unmoving sitting position. Think of not thinking. How do you think of not thinking? Non-thinking. This in itself is the essential art of Zazen. So, what does non-thinking mean to you? Brad Warner has a little blurb here from his blog that discusses non-thinking. And what he says is the Japanese word translated here as thinking is shiryo. This is a word used to describe deliberate thinking and is often translated as consideration or deliberation rather than thinking. The words kangeru or omu are closer in meaning to the English word thinking. Dogen does not use those words. The kind of thinking Dogen is talking about here isn't the stream of random images and feelings that crop up in our heads, whether we want them to or not. He's talking about deliberately pondering things, deliberately chasing our thoughts, or investigating our feelings, or deliberately comparing what we imagine Zazen ought to be with what our Zazen right now really is. So Dogen is not telling us to silence our brains. He's not saying that we should have an absolute blank mind during Zazen. He isn't saying that if an image of Glenn Danzig on a surfboard or the memory of a really good almond Danish floats up through your head during Zazen, you have utterly failed. Instead, he's saying that we should try not to spend our Zazen time deliberately pondering stuff. When images, memories, feelings, and such like arise in our minds during practice, we'd be better off trying to open the hand of thought, as Uchiyama Roshi said, and let them go without chasing, investigating, or judging them. So that sounds a little easier than not having any thoughts whatsoever or at all, doesn't it? I think Suzuki Roshi put it best. Suzuki Roshi says, open the front door, open the back door. Let your thoughts come and go as they please. Just don't invite any of them to stay for tea. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay, moving on. The Zazen I speak of is not learning meditation. It is simply the Dharma gate of repose and bliss. It is the practice realization of totally culminated enlightenment. It is things as they are in suchness. No traps or snares can ever reach it. Once its heart is grasped, you are like the dragon when he reaches the water, like the tiger when he enters the mountains. You must know that when you are doing Zazen, right there, the authentic Dharma is manifesting itself, striking aside dullness and distraction from the first. So once again, what he's saying here is that Zazen is a manifestation of enlightenment. Thoughts? Questions? This being the case, intelligence or lack of it does not matter. No distinction exists between the dull and sharp-witted. If you concentrate your efforts single-mindedly, you are thereby negotiating the way with your practice, realization undefiled. As you proceed along the way, you will attain a state of everydayness. Any thoughts on what a state of everydayness is? Maybe perhaps seeing things in everyday things outside of a specific practice. So that what you experience in Zazen, you experience every day as you're walking through the world. Any other spins on that anybody can see? And finally, he closes up Fukanzazengi with the following. You have gained the pivotal opportunity of human form. Do not let your time pass in vain. You are maintaining the essential function of the Buddha way. Would you take meaningless delight in the spark from a flint stone? Form and substance are like dewdrops on the grass. Destiny like the dart of lightning, vanishing in an instant, disappearing in a flash. Honored followers of Zen, you who have been long accustomed to groping for the elephant, please do not be suspicious of the true dragon. Devote your energy to a way that points directly to suchness. Revere the person of complete attainment beyond all human agency. Gain accord with the enlightenment of the Buddhas. Succeed to the legitimate lineage of the patriarch Samadhi. Constantly comport yourselves in such a manner, and you are assured of being a person such as they. Your treasure store will open up of itself, and you will use it at will. And thus Dogen closes Fukanzazengi and begins to gather students. Next week, we'll talk about Dogen's career as a teacher, writer, and religious leader, and we will delve into the Genjo koan. Any questions, comments?
Well, let me just limit it to one. So this is a topic that I've thought about my entire life, basically, and it has to do with the nature of humans. So I think when I saw the advertisement for this, it was framed as there was something about original sin compared to original enlightenment.
Right.
And so just to follow that thread for a few seconds, if Christianity proposes original sin, Judaism proposes something like an evil inclination. I don't think it's extreme as Christianity. It's sort of like a spectrum. And if we say there's original enlightenment, that's sort of on the other side of the spectrum of sort of the opposite of original sin, right? Like
well, there was Pelagius who was at the same time as St. Augustine, and he had a doctrine of original blessing that was kind of an opposite of original sin.
Okay, yeah, okay.
So we're kind of triangulating here with original.
Right, and I think that's a Gnostic school. And so it didn't become the majority stream, right? So my question is, okay, Judaism's answer was to have law to counter what is, let's say, the philosophy of an evil inclination. You need law to keep people on a good path. Christianity calls that legalistic, and they created they revere the Ten Commandments, but it's more like you follow a godlike person, and we'll say it's Jesus. Okay. So in Zen, definitely the precepts are huge.
Right.
But if you look at what I struggle with, the question that I've always grappled with is, if you look at humans, they do really terrible things and they do some really good things. And so where is if we say, how is just sitting keeping people good?
Well, for one thing, Dogen says that if you're doing it right, it's the Buddha doing it through you.
Okay.
That now, also, Dogen really doesn't believe in a force of evil in the universe. There's only doing wrong, which then echoes and ripples through the universe. But he doesn't believe in a force of evil.
Neither does Judaism.
Pardon?
Neither does Judaism.
Right. So I mean, and I get it. You would probably go to this. His advice is your question, what do we do to keep from being evil? Or
I think, yeah, it's not refined, obviously. So I'm thinking out loud here. So it's more like, how do you, if there is original enlightenment, if everybody has, let's say if the Abrahamic religions are more like, we need guidelines or laws to have people act correctly. I mean, I think that generally the public does not think, when they think Zen, they think of some mystical practice. And I think very few people think of, it's very much based in the Ten Commandments. I mean, we call them precepts, but it's very much like that. So in that sense, I understand. If there is an original enlightenment or original good, why would there be so much emphasis on the precepts? If people would naturally be inclined to be enlightened, which would translate as all compassionate, all wise.
Right, right. Exactly. You kind the precepts aren't as much law as something you live into, I guess. For instance, I mean, I don't see the precepts as a big challenge to me. You know, it's kind of in the way I live. Yes.
I'm gonna do a thing here, sorry. Just to make sure that to make sure that everybody's hearing all of the things. If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll give you the mic, because that way the Zoom people will hear you too, which will make life easier. And one thing we want to make sure the Zoom folks are hearing is, I think we had some people asking questions, not realizing that if you're in the Zoom meeting and you want to ask a question, we need you to just type it into the chat, and then we'll be able to read those questions out to Russ to ask them here. Sorry. Just a little technical.
Yeah, well, I'm
intro
sorry I
there.
didn't mention that earlier,
No,
right?
it's okay. We didn't search out for that.
But
So
you know,
can I-
he says in here, revere the person of complete attainment beyond all human agency. And I guess I see that as a lot of, you know, the whole thing of the Sangha and the monastery is you're around somebody who has attained realization. And so it kind of rubs off on you. You see how they comport themselves, you comport yourself accordingly, and that sort of thing. You want what they have. And so that seems to be one of his suggestions here. Revere the person of complete attainment beyond all human agency. Gain accord with the enlightenment of the Buddhas. Succeed to the legitimate lineage of the patriarch Samadhi. So that's his recommendation. Does that address your question?
So I guess that this is sort of the crux of it. It seems to make more logical sense to me. You're naturally going to go off the path. So here's all these guidelines and laws to help you stay on the right path. But if the premise is because there's something innately deficient. But if the philosophy is that it's all sufficient, you're innately good, or you have original enlightenment, why then all the laws and guides, all the guidelines, or all the teachers, or all the precepts to keep you on the path?
You know, as you were saying that, I kind of fell into a Christian to the answer to your question. The French mathematician and philosopher and mystic Blaise Pascal once said, most of the world's problems can be traced to the inability of people to sit with themselves for 30 minutes. So that's coming from a Christian perspective, but that seems to be an endorsement of Shikantaza.
I think of sitting, for example, is an opportunity to melt and eradicate the ego. And as you do that, you see how we are connected and the world is connected. And so the way you act towards others has an impact. And that's kind of the impetus to act in the correct way. So you would not kill you would not kill another person, not because of some precept or some religious rule or law, but you just wouldn't do that because you're killing yourself by doing that. So that's sort of how I perceive, the idea of acting the right way comes from within you. And if you sit long enough, the way will reveal itself to you. You don't even need teachers to some extent. Right?
Yeah.
This is so dangerous, but we'll see what I can do here. Just the things that come up for me in this. So I'm very much, I have everything to learn in this space. As you, I can only turn back to a Christian perspective because it's the only thing I really have any kind of a hold on. But the that notion of I'm not going to have the words for it, but being born with enlightenment, being born with access to this thing. For me, that can be true. And it is true that, I don't know, for me, it's my human nature that is, that pulls me out. And so there are things about my sort of just fallible humanity that are going to pull me out, not because it isn't real that I always had it, not that I doubt that internal goodness was with me from the beginning and will always be with me, but that, but things external can pull me away from that path. And that I don't know specifically the precepts, but that there are things that help me go, you really wanted to be on that path. And there are things that can help pull me back into it. So I don't see them as necessarily being like, it makes sense to me that I would need help with those things. It doesn't surprise me, I guess, that something can pull me out of that inherent goodness, even if it was always there and was always mine. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Can I switch gears on myself?
Sure.
Back to those earlier places where you're asking about questions. These last 4 slides, those questions and those the ways that you talked about the sitting and the non-thinking, I feel like if we could all hear and embrace those things. I talk to so many people who want to meditate and feel like they can't. And it's that concern that they can't do the non-thinking that is the way that what we think non-thinking means.
Yes.
And so we stop or we belittle ourselves or we say, I can't do that, or it doesn't work for me, or that can't be part of my practice. But the things that you've shared here, I wish I could hold on to them and sort of share them further out to help us have maybe a different understanding of what it means to be in that non-thinking state, that flow state of back door open, front door, and that things can pass through. It's that I'm just not inviting them in. So I just appreciate in some ways the simplicity of some of those pieces of guidance for meditation.
Yeah, right. I think that's a big key to it is the simplicity of it. Let me stop the share.
Okay, Russ, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The question is this. Oh, it's a remark. Dogen seemed to know what he wanted from the begging or beginning. Rather, he knew what he didn't want and kept moving on to the next teacher, monastery, or step in his path.
Yeah, I think, he certainly knew he wasn't getting the answer he wanted. And like that part I read from the Mountains and Rivers Sutra, Dogen largely felt a lot of people were hiding behind irrationality and cryptic talk and weren't quite as enlightened as they claimed to be. I mean, he was shrewd enough, that he had a strong sense of smell. Let's put it that way. I think. But yeah, I think there's a lot to that. He seemed to know what he was looking for. Of course, he was doing all this from, what was really driving his bus was his experience at his mother's funeral, the overwhelming experience of impermanence, watching the incense smoke rise at his mother's funeral. That's what really shaped his question. But yeah, that's a good point. To an extent, yeah, he sort of knew what he was looking for and kept moving until he found it. All right, well, hopefully we'll see all of y'all next week.
Thanks, Russell.